I grew up during the 70s in a little place called Vernon up in British Columbia. It's a nice enough place, I guess, good place to raise a family, but after scrapping my way through high school, I was faced with a sort of bleak future. I didn't really like the sound of working menial jobs around Vernon for the rest of my life, but at the same time, I didn't want to just pack up and leave. I liked Vernon. All of my friends and family were there, but most of the jobs available to me involved punching the clock for someone else. I knew I couldn't listen to some idiot hoser give me orders all day, and neither did I want to be a cop or a fireman or anything else that paid good money without a degree. All I wanted to do was work on motorcycles. Only thing was, I didn't have a motorcycle, nor did I have the money to buy one, and minus expenses, I'd be working some crappy McBurger Hut job for 18 months before I could afford even the cheapest of the models I was interested in. And that's when my uncle let me know about a logging company up near Lumbee that was looking for workers. I don't know what it's like these days, but it was easy to become a lumberjack back then, mainly because you'd have to be half crazy to want to do something so dangerous. To compensate, the pay was really generous, and since you didn't even need a high school diploma, it was a popular choice for guys who had the stones to do such a hazardous job. You gotta remember, this was the late 70s. There weren't all those safety regulations like you have today where even the ass wipe has reflective safety strips on it. People got hurt back then. It was just a thing that happened, and when I first started as a lumberjack, there were guys who said that I wouldn't make it a month without picking up my first scar. I figured if I was careful, I could beat the odds and make it the 7 months that I needed to work to be able to afford a bike without getting myself hurt. I was right, and it turned out all that fear-mongering was just a way of screwing with the new guy, but another guy I signed on with, same age, same sort of background, he lost his life out there in those woods, and to this day, I don't think the cops know who did it. So, just a few months after I started, this other kid my age signed on named McNally. The kid's first name was Adam, but everyone just called him by his surname, and we didn't really work together much, so I didn't know much about him as a person. But I heard stories, and they weren't good. Kid was quiet, kind of lazy, kind of weird, and he caused all kinds of problems for the crews that he worked with. He was always late, even when we were staying out at logging camps where he had literally no place else to be. He'd disappear for an hour at a time, and the guys started to think that he was off getting high or something. But since the crew chief couldn't ever find any drugs on him, all they could do was give him warnings until they had enough on him to fire him. And then one day, McNally just disappeared. The crew he was working with said that he just walked off into the woods, saying that he needed to take a leak, and then that was the last they saw of him. We weren't at a logging camp at the time, so the other guys on his crew figured that he just quit and walked back into Lumbee without telling anyone. I mean, they didn't even really notice that he was missing until he had been gone for about 3 or 4 hours, and even then, they only did a quick look around the area before reporting back that McNally was gone. The next morning, he doesn't show up for work, so we figured that he's gone for good, and just carry on with our lives. And then a week or so later, and I only heard this secondhand, his mom showed up at the foreman's office. She was worried sick and hadn't heard from her son since the day he walked off the job, but rather than just call the cops, she spent the past few days driving around looking for him. That was another big reason we figured McNally was into something illegal. Why wouldn't his mom just call the cops right away, especially if she was so worried? The only reason I can think of is that she didn't want the cops finding him before she did, but that's just a theory, I guess, and maybe an incorrect one given what happened next. Anyway, she asked us to keep an eye out for him, and then a couple of days later, the cops showed up. I don't know what was said between the police officer and our foreman, but the next thing we know, we're being asked to help the cops walk through the woods near where McNally went missing. The foreman didn't seem too happy about it, and I think maybe the implication had been that one of us had something to do with McNally disappearing. If that was the case, I can understand him halting operations for a few hours to make us pitch in, like a show of good faith or something. No one objecting to pitching in either, especially since it potentially involved one of our own getting hurt. McNally was an idiot, no doubt about that, but he wasn't a bad kid, and seeing his mom all shaken up definitely lit a fire under a lot of guys' butts. We grouped up, and then the cop that showed up organized us into long lines and then marched us through the woods in the direction McNally had gone missing. We walked like that for quite a while, keeping our eyes on the ground, and there came a point where I was long past thinking that we weren't going to find anything. But then right when we were talking about turning back around again, one of the guys on the far right flank started calling out that he'd found something. We all rushed over to see this single, solitary boot just laying there in the dirt. It's not like we knew the exact make, model, or size of the boots McNally was wearing, but somehow we all knew it was his. Knowing we were headed in the right direction, the cop called us off the search and thanked us for our time, then got to calling in some backup so they could continue the search properly. All the crews were abuzz with this idea on what had happened, and some guys were pretty skeptical and thought that we were making a whole bunch of fuss out of nothing. All we'd found was a boot, one that had probably slipped off after he'd walked off to get high or something. Others seemed to be convinced that we had a full-on murder investigation on our hands and that the prime suspect was one of our number. Personally, I didn't know what to think, not until they found McNally's body out there in the woods. We had cops coming in and out of camp for the next couple of days, but never in huge numbers, and then one day, we showed up to work to a whole flurry of activity, and it didn't take long for us to figure out why. The cops wouldn't really talk to us about what was going on. Their chief spoke to our chief to explain what was going on, and then as the rumors started to swirl, the press got wind, and then there were reporters on the site before we knew it. They were very much focused on talking to us than the cops were, but there wasn't much we could tell them. We just knew that it was bad based on what little we'd overheard the cops saying. From what we'd heard, after the cops found McNally's body and photographed the crime scene, they had to transport the pieces of him back through the woods to a waiting coroner's truck. Pieces of him, not a whole body, just pieces. Based on that, we assumed it was some kind of animal attack, or at least that an animal had gotten to his remains after he died from whatever else it was that killed him. But then a few days later, the cops showed up to the lumberyard with a search warrant, and then after they turned the place upside down, they left with 3 members of McNally's lumber crew with the intention of questioning them at the station. At that point, some of us got to thinking, holy crap, did McNally's crew just get sick of him and decide to disappear him? But the idea seemed insane. He was one more mess-up away from getting fired, and if they had a problem with the guy, they'd just tell him to his face, not take him out into the woods and saw him up like the freaking Lumbee Chainsaw Massacre. And lo and behold, they were released without charge and they never heard from the cops again. But there was definitely a time when they thought that it was one of us that had killed McNally and that we'd cut him up with a saw once we were done. But then after a while, we found out why none of us had actually been charged with the murder. The cops had ruled it out fairly early, and McNally's body had been cut up into pieces when they found it, but it hadn't been cut up like with a chainsaw. His arms, legs, and head had been torn off before being stacked all neatly in a little hollowed-out tree trunk. The last part was all but confirmed by the local cops when they refused to flat-out deny the rumors of how McNally's body was found. Everything else is still rumor as far as I'm concerned, all unconfirmed, and I honestly hope they stay that way too, because some of the things I've heard since are enough to curdle your blood. I'm mainly talking about things I heard on my last month or so on the job. I stayed on for a while after I bought my Harley, just to squirrel away for some savings so I could move down here to Phoenix, and in that time, I heard a lot of scuttlebutt involving how McNally met his end. I don't want to speculate on what that might have been. I heard some theories that sound a little too disrespectful to the dead, but I'd rather not take part in what amounts to rumor spreading. But I've often wondered what happened to McNally out there. If it was a debt or some other criminal thing catching up to him or something else entirely. Because if it were anything in that something else category, something more or less inexplainable, then it could have just as easily been me out there, ripped up and stacked in a hollowed-out tree trunk, with all the agony in the world still etched on my cold, dead face. " Back around Christmas of 2007, me and my mates were still a bunch of layabouts in our mid-20s. We worked odd jobs here and there, so we weren't complete wasters, but we spent most of our time sitting around my mate's flat, just drinking cans, smoking soap bar, which is cannabis resin, and flicking through the channels on a skybox. One night, we were looking for something half-decent to watch when we came across some Ray Mears thing on the Discovery Channel. For those of you that don't know, Ray Mears was like a less exciting 90s version of Bear Grylls. He'd go all around the world, showing you how to survive in places like the Arctic or the jungle or what have you. It was cracking TV seeing him eating raw fish or foraging for berries, and as we watched, we started playfully arguing over which one of us would be the first to quit if we went on some mad survival trip like that. What started as a stupid argument ended in an actual bet between the two of the lads, and I think they were just messing around at first. But then the more they talked about it, the more serious it got. And then the next thing I heard, they'd bet each other £100 that they could outlast each other out in the wilderness, and we were seriously planning some survival camping trip to Wales. Luke and Ben, the two lads who made the bet, wanted to go down to Dartmoor where the Royal Marines train. Dartmoor is this big empty floodplain for the most part, and Ben's brother, who was in the army, said they'd die if they went there in February or March like they were planning to. Instead, he suggests they go to this place called Kielder Forest up in Northumberland. He said he'd been on exercises around there years ago and that it's the closest place he'd ever seen in the UK to actual wilderness. They'd also have a much better chance of finding water, food, and shelter, which would actually put their survival skills to the test, instead of just dumping them in the big, soggy desert that is Dartmoor. When they had their location, Ben and Luke were as good as gone. There was just one problem. They needed an adjudicator. What was stopping either bloke from just slipping away, getting a hotel room and waiting for the other one to give up before reappearing to claim victory with a bit of mud smeared on their face? They needed a third, someone to make sure that they played fair, and that someone ended up being me. Granted, they didn't have to talk me into it too hard. I was half keen on the idea anyways, to be honest, but what they really needed was someone to give them a bit of focus. Their rough plan was to just walk off into the woods, then stay there with minimal food until one of them gave up. I didn't think starving themselves in the middle of nowhere seemed like a very good idea, so instead, I came up with a kind of challenge. We get the train up to Carlisle, then hop on another one to get to a little town called Brampton, and then from there, we were going to walk just shy of 21 miles through Kielder Forest. Going about 7 miles a day, sleeping 2 nights in the forest with 1 night in a 4-star bed and breakfast waiting for us at the end. I know that's stepping back from the original intentions a bit, but I didn't fancy some pointlessly grueling vision quest, especially when a few days' hike would easily break the pair of them. They had 0 wild hiking or wild camping experiences between them, whereas I'd done the Duke of Edinburgh Award in school, and it was just about the only bit I ever really enjoyed. Now cut to early March of 2008, and we got in our hands on all the gear we needed, which consisted of things like ponchos, boil-in-the-bag meals, proper cold weather sleeping bags, and stuff like that. We got a 7 a.m. train up to Carlisle, jumped on a bus to Brampton, and then after that, it was into the wilderness. Now, I put wilderness in quotations like that because for the first day of walking, we were mostly just walking through farmers' fields, hopping fences, and watching Kielder Forest looming larger and larger in the distance. Ben and Luke gave it a go, but I know they must have been feeling it after the first day's hike, 'cause I was bloody knackered myself. We pitched our shelters in a patch of trees only about a mile away from Kielder proper, and then resigned ourselves to starting on the hardest parts of the hike in the morning. Considering the time of year and where we were, sleeping outside like that was rough, very rough. It wasn't actually all that cold. There was no snow and only a bit of light rain during the night, but what made it so hard was the wind. We tried to find ourselves a bit of cover from it, but it picked right up during the night. It took the temperatures right down, and it was literally howling through the trees above our heads. So after a couple of hours spent shivering in our sleeping bags and trying to block out the noise, we decided to just get on the move again. We went from up for it to this isn't fun anymore in the space of a few hours, and as soon as we'd walked far enough into the forest to get real wind cover, we set down our packs, set up a temporary camp, and then had a quick snooze after a small breakfast of peanut butter and crackers. It wasn't hard going, but for me, that was all offset by seeing how badly Luke and Ben were coping. They would not stop whinging for the whole of that second morning, and I think that there were points where the pair of them acting like big girls' blouses was the only thing pushing me on. So after a quick snooze, a cup of tea and a few smokes, we stamped out the little fire that we had going and then carried on through the woods. After about 2 hours worth of walking, we were in the complete middle of nowhere. On the outer edges of the forest, there were still a few paths that we could stick to, which made it much easier on us. But then as we got deeper and deeper, the little paths and trails disappeared completely, and that's when it started getting really tough. We were walking with quite a bit of weight anyway, but then having to hike across uneven ground, snaking in and out of the trees, it got way more tiring than we could have predicted, and it made navigating really difficult too. We realized that if we kept up the same pace, we might be in for an extra night having to sleep in the woods. The more tired we got, the less ground we'd covered, which is, again, something we hadn't stopped to consider when planning the route. The mood got quite dark at one point because we only had so much food and so many changes of clean clothes. So our fun little survival trip was fast becoming a bit of a nightmare, if I'm being honest. Then right when I thought that we were on the verge of having a bit of argy-bargy amongst ourselves, we stumbled across Burnside Lodge. So 1 minute we're hiking, mostly keeping our eyes on the dodgy ground so we wouldn't twist an ankle or something, and then we can see it. There was a clearing in the trees, and as we got closer, we saw the outline of two buildings. One looked like an old derelict cottage type thing, while the other was a much smaller coal or woodshed, only it was made completely of stone. We circled at a wide arc for a few minutes, making sure that they were deserted, then veered in to take a closer look once we were sure they were empty. The smaller woodshed-looking thing turned out to be what's called a bothy. I didn't know what one is either when I first heard it, and I'll probably end up butchering the explanations, so this is word for word what Wikipedia says. A bothy is a basic shelter, usually left unlocked and available for anyone to use free of charge. It was also a term for basic accommodation, usually for gardeners or other workers on an estate. Basically a free room so people wouldn't freeze to death on long journeys back in the day. It was just one big open-plan room inside, with one table, one fireplace, and a few dusty old sleeping mats. On any other occasion, I don't think we'd have touched that place with a 10-foot barge pole, but since it looked like rain was on the way and we were already looking at an extra day's walking, a night in that bothy didn't seem so bad anymore. We figured we'd at least have a 5-minute breather since we were there, and in that time, Ben decided to go and have a look at the abandoned cottage-looking place. I remember thinking that he was just going to have a look through the windows or something, but when a few minutes went by and he hadn't returned, I stuck my head out of the bothy to find him nowhere to be seen, with the cottage's previously closed door wide open. We didn't know the do's and don'ts of staying in a bothy, so I was about to tell him to get out of the cottage just in case someone actually owned it, when I suddenly hear a dog barking from the nearby tree line. The dog's running around, barking its head off, racing to and from a bloke that emerges just seconds later. He sees us and shouts something like, "Oi, what's going on over there?" So I assume it's the cottage's owner and start sort of whisper shouting at Ben to get his arse out of that cottage. He's already heard the dog barking, though, and he walks out looking all nervous like he's been caught with his hand in the biscuit tin. As the bloke gets closer, moving a bit faster, looking all annoyed, his dog starts getting closer and closer too, running up and barking at us before legging it back to him. To our relief, he puts the dog on a lead, then walks over asking us what the hell we think we're doing. I just thought on my feet, and I told the bloke that we thought the place was abandoned. He replied that it wasn't abandoned, and the owner wouldn't be too happy if someone decided to trespass when there was a perfectly good shelter across the clearing to use. We start panicking, thinking he's going to call the police or something, or maybe even worse, that he's going to kick us out of the bothy so we lose out on a sheltered place to sleep for the night. But then, right as we start proper apologizing non-stop, he breaks into a smile, then a full-on laugh, and gives us the old, "Had you going there, didn't I?" He thought it was hilarious. We didn't appreciate it one bit, and as Luke finally joined us to see what was going on, he explained the joke. He wasn't the owner, but he did know the bloke who owned it, and apparently the cottage was just as open to visitors as the bothy. But then the whole time he's explaining, his dog is either eyeing us up or outright growling at us. He kept having to drag back on the lead every so often, and it got to the point where it was making me proper nervous. The bloke looked to be in his early 50s, so not exactly frail or anything, but I got the feeling that if that dog really wanted to go for us, that he'd have a hell of a time trying to hang on to it. Now anyways, he tells us we're fine to stay in the bothy overnight, and apologizes for his dog because she doesn't like strangers, and then Ben asks him his name. You know, just to be polite or cordial or whatever you want to call it. The bloke hears Ben's question, then instead of just telling us his name, he pauses for a second, and then says, "Gary." It was one of the most obvious lies I've ever seen in my life, like he just so obviously made it up on the spot, and we all knew it. It made for an awkward moment, but what exactly were we going to do? Call him out on it? He'd basically just announced that he was a bit of a weirdo, because who lies about their name like that? And just so we could avoid him, we sleep in the bothy, and then we'll be gone the following morning at first light. I didn't feel unsafe, not from just a weird lie, so we thanked him for letting us know about the bothy and then started walking back towards it. After a few feet, this Gary calls out to us again like, "Here, lads," and then after we stop and turn, he asks us, "Have any of you ever been," and I'll just spell it out, "RAPED." It sounds absolutely mental, I know, just to ask out of the blue like that, and we reacted pretty much as you'd imagine. I was like, "What did you just say, mate?" With a bit of a confrontational tone, but more out of disbelief than anything else. Ben, on the other hand, didn't need him to repeat it, and being the hard case that he was, he takes a few steps forward towards the bloke before asking a very rhetorical version of the same question I'd asked. He wanted to see if the bloke had the balls to repeat such an incredibly creepy and inappropriate question. The bloke didn't repeat it, but I don't think it's 'cause he didn't have the balls to. He just stays quiet, but this big, horrible grin comes over his face, like he's proper enjoying our reaction, and by that time, we're asking him, "Why would you ask us something like that? Are you looking for a problem?" And all this other stuff. And the bloke just keeps quiet, like he's soaking it up, and then ignores all of our questions and just says, "I have." I swear to God, right? We all just shut up for a second. You know when you hear or see something so mental that it takes a second to process before you can react? Exactly that for a moment or two, as we're just silently like, what in God's name? I don't think Ben knew how to react at all, because he takes another few steps towards the bloke, ready to swing for him, but the bloke's dog just goes absolutely mental. It's proper roaring at him, choking itself on the lead trying to get to him, and the whole time the bloke's having to lean back to hold it one place while smiling as if to say, "I wouldn't come any closer if I were you." Ben comes to his senses and backs off, as we all do, but not before parting jibes, calling him a fanny for hiding behind his dog, and a weirdo for trying to creep a few strangers out with a subject that isn't the least bit funny. And as you can probably guess, we weren't so keen on staying in that bothy overnight anymore, not with Gary and his psycho dog hanging around. I mean, we could try, but none of us wouldn't gotten a wink of sleep again, so instead, we decided to brave the elements again. We got our bags on our backs, making sure to keep an eye on Gary, who by that point had gone inside the cottage to do God knows what, and then made ourselves scarce as soon as we could. Gary didn't follow us, but what he did do was come out onto the cottage's front step just as we reached the trees on the other side of the clearing. He wasn't following us, but we knew which direction we were going, and although that didn't bother us at the time, I know now that it really should have. We were still raging for a long time after we walked out of that clearing and then back into the trees, but if I'm being honest, a lot of that anger was covering up for the fact that we were actually really scared. It wasn't just the disgusting question the bloke had asked us, and it wasn't just the dog either. It was like the combination of the two was bigger than the sum of its parts. A mad dog might do a bit of damage, but me, Ben, and Luke between us would have been able to, do a bit of damage back, maybe even take the thing down. And if it wasn't for the dog, I think Ben would have just chinned him, and that would have been it. But like I said, it was the two things together that had us all turning tail when we might not have done otherwise, and the tense atmosphere stayed with us for the next mile or so. We asked each other a few times, like, reckon he'll follow us? But all agreed that he wouldn't. The bloke looked to be in his early 50s, quite short and stout with what looked like a bit of a gammy leg. There was no way that he'd be able to match our speed even with our big, heavy backpacks on. But then again, he did have something that would be able to match our speed, and as that little tidbit occurred to us, we heard the faint sound of a barking dog coming through the trees behind us. Now that was an oh crap moment if ever there was one. I remember us all freezing, and the conversation suddenly stopped as we kept quiet to make sure that we were all hearing the same thing. If my face looked anything like Ben and Luke's, then I went white as a bloody sheet as it suddenly hit me. He was following us, and although we'd be able to outrun him, there was no outrunning an angry dog. The sound was still faint at that point. The dog had to be at least a half a mile back, maybe a little bit less. So as frightened as we were, we didn't start legging it right away or anything. We just started moving a bit faster and at a little bit of an angle too to try and throw him off our trail. And then as we walked, instead of the barking getting fainter or going quiet, it gradually got louder and louder. I'm not saying that we weren't leaving a really obvious trail to follow, and obviously the dog could follow us just by scent, but realizing the bloke was actually capable of tracking us and was gaining on us too, that ramped the fear up by another notch. Ben hadn't been able to get a good look at that cottage-looking place, so we had no idea if the bloke had a weapon of some kind stashed away. Best case scenario, he was chasing us with a knife or a bat. Worst case, a machete or an axe, or absolutely worst case scenario, he had a shotgun or something like that. It was unlikely, but it wasn't out of the question. It's almost impossible to own a gun legally in the UK, but if there's one group that finds it easier than most, it's farmers. Farmers then get targeted for that very reason, that they've sometimes 2 or 3 guns stashed somewhere that can then get sawn off and mostly used in gang shootings and stuff like that. But the point is, it wasn't completely out of the question that he'd have a gun, but obviously, our most pressing concern was the dog. There came a point when the barking was so loud that we broke into a sort of half-jog, the only speed we were capable of while wearing our big, heavy packs. We kept running, hearing the barking getting louder and louder. I remember seeing a big open stream through the trees ahead of us. When we reached the bank, we stopped, panting, wondering what we were going to do. It was quite a wide stream, and it looked quite a bit deep in places too, with no other way of crossing it. It looked like we'd have to just take off our packs and then try to float them across while we waded behind them. I knew it was a bad idea, that soaking ourselves would make keeping warm a major problem, but as the barking reached its loudest point, we actually laid our eyes on the dog running through the trees right at us, and we realized that we didn't have much of a choice. As we waded into the water, I remember thinking how wrong we were to assume that we could defend ourselves from the dog. All 3 of us at once, yeah, we could do some damage to it, but one bite in the wrong place, one vein or one artery, and it was game over for us. We really were in the middle of absolute nowhere, so even a semi-serious injury could be fatal instead of just some minor emergency visit. The water went up to my waist, and then my chest, and then at its deepest, I struggled to keep my head above it. And I knew that I wasn't going to drown, but just for a second there, I wondered if we hadn't made some horrible mistake in trying to wade across. As the water started to get lower again and I approached the opposite bank, I had to switch from pushing my back to dragging it behind me. It was twice, maybe 3 times as heavy thanks to all the water it had soaked up, but I was glad to see that Luke and Ben had made it through the deepest parts of the stream and were following me up the bank. But then any relief that I felt was instantly drowned up by the sudden appearance of the dog on the opposite bank. I thought it would just throw itself into the stream, swim across, and then attack us, and if that was the case, we'd be in a much worse position to defend ourselves, seeing as we were gassed and soaking wet. But then it didn't. It didn't even try and cross. It just barked at us from the opposite bank for a bit and then ran back in the direction of its master. We didn't waste any time in appreciating the absolute miracle that had just happened in front of us. Maybe the dog was just scared of the deep water or something. It wouldn't be like any dog I'd ever heard of, but it wasn't a completely unbelievable explanation. But like I said, we didn't spend any time trying to work out why. We just tried to empty out the water from our packs as quickly as we could, threw them back on, and then get back into the half jog as we tried to put as much distance between us and the stream as possible. I think it must have been about an hour before we finally reached the edge of the forest, or rather, the section of the forest that we'd just been in. Out in front of us was a couple of fields, a walking track, and another section of forest on the other side of them, and I can't speak for Ben and Luke, but as soon as I saw the first signs of civilization and potential safety, my legs gave out completely. Not being able to hear any dog barks helped too, and we all collapsed into a wet heap once we'd broken through the trees. Both mine and Ben's phones were scrambled because of the water, but Luke's had somehow survived being in his inside jacket pocket. And with that, we did the only thing we could do, and tried to phone the police, but between the crappy reception and the scrappy amount of detail that we could offer them, there wasn't much that they could do for us there and then. The woman on the other end said that she'd asked the park rangers to have a look around the bothy, but since no crime had actually been committed, all they'd be able to do was give the bloke a warning about threatening behavior. We all knew that there wasn't a load that they could do, and I remember Luke still being really polite and thankful on the phone, but we all knew it'd be best to keep moving, just in case he came looking for us again. Now, I won't bore you with the rest of the trip. We managed to get dry, completed our hike, and then made it home only a day over schedule. But none of us had ever forgotten what happened out there with that bloke and his dog. We told the story 100 times between us in the weeks that followed, mainly to semi-impress people with the story of our gallant survival against the odds. Sarcasm, by the way. Again, I can't speak for Ben and Luke, but if they're anything like me, they left one little detail out of the story every time they told it. And that little detail involves that horrible, disgusting question the bloke asked us, along with his equally creepy follow-up. I'd rather forget that part altogether if I'm being honest, partly because of how it makes my skin crawl to remember, and partly because it makes me wonder what that bloke would have done if he managed to get the better of one of us. For the longest time now, I've gone hiking whenever I've found the time. It started as a kind of stress reliever. I'd head out on my own for a walk around a local park with the aim of clearing my head or working out some point of contention within myself. And then, as my career and relationships advanced, I found that I needed to hike larger distances for longer lengths of time, just in the same way an addict needs more and more of their drug of choice to satisfy their cravings. Things got easier as time went on, and I went from being a chair-bound worrywart to something of a healthy, active outdoorsman. But the thing that never, ever got easier was hiking through the woods after sundown or before sunrise, especially in more remote areas. Some trips, especially in the summertime, I'd deliberately set out in the early evenings so I could hike through the woods after dark. I know I said it never got easier, but it also never got boring either. There's something very thrilling about being out there at night. Some of mankind's oldest and rawest fears are rooted in being afraid of the deep, dark woods, so being out there almost feels like trespassing, like you're somewhere you shouldn't be. And maybe it sounds pretty juvenile, but it brings me back to an almost childlike sense of awe and wonder. So what I'd usually do is hike out in the early evening, enjoy a few trails by flashlight, and then take a quick power nap in my hammock before waking up again, pre-dawn, and enjoying the sunrise. Usually speaking, these nocturnal walks went smoothly, and I never once had to think about removing the safety clasp on the can of my bear mace. At least, all except this one time, which put the absolute fear of God into me. It was late spring, around 4:30 in the morning when I woke up, so just less than an hour before dawn. I had around 5 miles to cover before I got back to my car, and I was in a low button that's wedged between two steep ridges. The trail I was on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in by thick underbrush, young maple, and old oak growth. I'm focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, completely zoned out. And then out of nowhere, I hear a loud crack, and I froze solid. My immediate reaction was one of fight or flight, but I'm also not a complete coward. So as much as I wanted to run the hell away from whatever made that noise, my logical brain told me it was nothing I couldn't handle. But then, right as I was getting my thoughts together, I heard the exact same sound again, and that time, since it wasn't so easily explained away, I started to legitimately panic. It wasn't a branch breaking. It wasn't deadfall or some widowmaker. What I'd heard was something intentional. It sounded like a decent-sized wooden stick being violently whacked against a smallish tree, and the thing that made it sound so unnatural that it was a cracking sound, not like a more natural-sounding thud or thump. It almost sounded explosive, and by that I mean like someone had thrown all their strength into smashing a stick against a tree, and they were doing so just 50 yards or so in front of me. After the second sound, I knew that I had to give the area a very wide berth. There was just one problem. After about 30 yards, I was going to hit a kind of U-turn on the trail, meaning that if I actually pushed forward and past the strange noise, I'd have to turn my back on it as I continued up the trail, and that made me very nervous. Whatever was making that noise, I sure as hell didn't want to turn my back to it, especially not in the dark. But if I wanted to get back to my car, I was going to have to. So with that in mind, I stayed rooted to the spot and just kept listening. A minute or so goes by and I don't hear a thing. It's dead quiet out there, and I still only got about half an hour before sunrise and relative safety. I didn't want to switch on my headlamp, as it'd definitely give away my position to whoever or whatever was out there. But as time went on, I realized the better option was to crank it up, do a 360 sweep, and get a definitive idea of what I was up against. If it was some psycho in a hockey mask looking for dessert after his entree of unsuspecting teenagers, then it was better I knew about it so I could beat feet in the opposite direction. Then again, if it was Bigfoot, it'd be nice to get a good old look at the big guy before he smacks my head off with like a 7-foot hairy Giancarlo Stanton. So, that's what I did. I switched on my headlamp, then took a look around. When you wear a headlamp in the woods every night, every tree branch in front of you casts a big black moving shadow on the trail. It's half the reason I prefer to only switch it on if I really need to. Our natural night vision is a powerful thing because a lot of our visual acuity in the dark is based on movement. You might not be able to see exactly what something is, but you can sure as hell make out when it's moving, especially when it's moving towards you. But then switch on a flashlight in a dark forest, and not only does it wreck your natural low-light vision, but all those moving shadows start to play tricks on you. You start focusing on the shadows and not what might be coming up behind them, but in a real emergency, you need to be able to see what you're doing. But then just as I finish weighing either option, I'm about to flick my headlamp on, I start smelling it. I smelled one too many dead animals in my time. When I was 9, my cat Oscar went missing for a few days. Oscar was an outdoor cat, so my parents tried to reassure me that he was on some kind of adventure and that he'd be back home before I knew it. After about a week, I started to get super worried, so my parents helped me make some little missing posters on Microsoft Word, and we started distributing them throughout the neighborhood. A couple of more days go by and we hadn't seen nor heard from my beloved Oscar. So I asked my mom if we could go looking for him in the woods behind our house. It wasn't like a big forest or anything, Just a small patch of trees with a stream running through it, and I guess my mom figured that I'd stop hounding her about it if she just took me for a walk out back. I think both she and my dad had a pretty good idea that Oscar wasn't coming home, but what my mom clearly didn't consider was that I was going to find his body. That was the first time I smelled death, and the second time was an unfortunate incident involving a possum, the wheel of my truck, and a 90-mile journey on hot pavement. The point is, I know what death smells like, so I can tell you without a doubt that whatever I smelled out there in the woods that morning, it wasn't quite death, but boy, was it close. It had all the pungency of rotten meat, that same kind of hot stench that attacks your nostrils, whether you're breathing through them or not. But there wasn't the same sort of oldness to the smell, if that makes sense. Like it wasn't rot or decay I was smelling, but something different. I think the closest way I can describe it is if you took wet dog smell, multiplied it by like 1,000, then threw in a little fresh durian fruit, then filtered it all through a wet diaper. It was foul beyond imagination, but at the same time, it wasn't dead or rotten. It was very much alive. It took one more thwack of the wood on wood to send me hurtling in the opposite direction. I knew it'd double or even triple my journey back to my car, but there was no way that I was about to keep walking along that trail and up the ridge, and there was also no way that I was about to flick my headlamp on and light myself up like a Christmas tree. I had just enough vision to keep going at full speed for a while. Then once I ran out of steam, I kept running at intervals whenever I was able. I'd never experienced fear of that magnitude before, like an animal fear, something older than us that's hardwired into our sort of programming. I hike, I'm not a runner, I hate running, but that morning, I ran longer and harder than I ever have in my entire life, and I guess it was all in hopes of saving it. Now I want to end this by saying that after having told this story a few times before, a lot of people were saying that the whole wood clacking thing is a classic Bigfoot-related phenomena. I was totally unaware of that particular detail until I made the mistake of posting a much shorter version of this elsewhere. And let me make it clear, I don't believe in Bigfoot, nor do I think that I ran into any other kind of supernatural phenomenon. Frankly, I don't know what the hell I ran into that morning, but I know in my gut that whatever it was really, really scary. On the evening of February 24th of 1978, 25-year-old Gary Dale Mathias was driving 4 close friends to California's Chico State University for a basketball game. They were part of a team called the Gateway Gators, a Yuba City-based program for people with mental disabilities, and were due to compete in a week-long tournament sponsored by the Special Olympics where the winners would receive an all-expenses-paid Hollywood vacation. Along with Dale Mathias, the team consisted of 29-year-old Bill Sterling, 24-year-old Jack Hewitt, 32-year-old Ted Wire, and 30-year-old Jack Madruga. Sterling and Hewitt had been officially diagnosed as mildly intellectually disabled, while Wire and Madruga, despite no official diagnosis, had been accepted onto the team on the grounds that they suffered learning difficulties. Dale Mathias and Jack Madruga also happened to be Army veterans, but while Madruga's service had been relatively uneventful, Mathias's time in West Germany had been anything but insignificant. What little is known of Mathias's childhood, it's clear that he developed severe drug problems while stationed in Europe. The devastating addiction eventually led to a schizophrenia diagnosis, and after a medical discharge from the Army, he returned home to Yuba to receive treatment at the local VA hospital. He was known for frequent violent outbursts, many of which resulted in close calls with the police, but by 1978, his demeanor appeared to have mellowed, and the cause was a heavy regimen of psychiatric medications. Mathias's doctors claimed that the key to his successful treatment had been a cocktail of stelazine and cogentin, and the side effects had been minimal. They called him one of our sterling success cases, and claimed that he was now more than capable of living a full and unimpeded life. To an extent, this was true, as Matthias supplemented his disability money by working in his stepfather's gardening business. He was also an integral member of the Gateway Gators and often drove them to various tournament and exhibition matches. Although their first game in the tournament wasn't until the following afternoon, Matthias and the boys drove out to Chico State the day before to cheer on the basketball team of UC Davis. Then, after watching the Davis team win, they drove to a nearby Bears Market to pick up some snacks. Some of the store's clerks remember their visit well, as Matthias and friends walked into the store less than 2 minutes before they were due to close. They appeared to be sober, in high spirits, and departed the grocery store in an orderly fashion shortly after 10 p.m. The clerk then continued closing up the store, having no idea that she'd be the last person to see the 5 men alive. The men's parents expected them home at around midnight, but when dawn came and went, and the boys were nowhere to be seen, their terrified parents notified the police. Police both in Butte and Yuba County began searching the route the men took to Chico, but after failing to find anything, they enlisted the help of the local Park Service. Forest rangers then fanned out all over the area, searching for any sign of the missing men. And then finally, on February 28th, a ranger from Plumas Forest told police that he'd spotted the group's car parked on a deep woods dirt track just off the Oroville-Quincy Road. When officers arrived at the scene, they discovered no signs of a struggle. The car was undamaged, and aside from a few candy wrappers strewn around the back seats, everything had been kept neat and tidy. Yet it was the location of the vehicle that raised the most questions. The 1969 Mercury Montego, which was registered to Jack Madruga, was found almost 70 miles away from the city of Chico, far from any direct route between there and Yuba City. For some reason, whoever had been driving the car had turned off the main highway down a winding dirt track, one which led all the way up to a remote, high-altitude area of forest. Jack Madruga, who was most likely to have been at the wheel, was believed to have loathed the cold weather, and according to his parents, would have never have driven up into the mountains of his own volition. If that was the case, then why had they done so? And why abandon their vehicle when their lack of warm winter clothing would ensure a deeply unpleasant experience? Upon closer analysis of the abandoned vehicle, it seemed as if though the car had been stuck in some kind of snowdrift. There was evidence of frantic wheel spinning, probably from where the driver had realized he was stuck and tried to spin the wheels to regain some traction. However, it was also noted that the snows that night wouldn't have been deep enough to completely strand the vehicle, and that 4 or 5 healthy young men would have been more than capable of freeing it. Police then raised the possibility that the vehicle had suffered some kind of mechanical fault, yet when they hotwired the car to test their theory, they discovered a fully functioning engine with a quarter tank of gasoline remaining. The car's keys were missing, suggesting the men had left the car in an orderly fashion with full intention to return following whatever they had planned. But the questions remained. Where exactly did they go, and why? After towing the turquoise and white Mercury back to the station, law enforcement discovered something very curious regarding the vehicle's condition. The Montego's undercarriage had no dents, gouges, or even mud scrapes, not even on its low-hanging muffler, despite having driven a long distance of a mountain road with many bumps and ruts. Either the driver had been extremely careful, or they had prior knowledge of the road's hazards. Jack Madruga's family categorically ruled this out, saying the only reason he'd have turned off the highway would be due to an emergency. They also added their son would never simply have left his car unwatched and unlocked, nor would he let anyone else drive his car. Unless, of course, it was under duress. Efforts were made to track the men's movements following their abandonment of their vehicle, but meager progression was quickly hampered by a heavy snowstorm on the day of the search. Just days later, extreme weather forced law enforcement to suspend the search until the arrival of more favorable conditions, meaning alternative avenues of investigation had to be explored. Following a public appeal for information, police received calls from several members of the public, all of whom claimed to have spotted the missing men. The vast majority of these were dismissed as either mistakes or hoaxes, but two supposed witness sightings rang eerily true to investigators. A Sacramento man named Joseph Shans told police that on the evening the men went missing, he spent the night at his cabin, which just happened to be in the same area as the abandoned Montego was found. His intention had been to perform a kind of reconnaissance mission, making sure the place was fit for habitation in advance of a week-long skiing trip that he had planned for his family. He drove up in the late afternoon, but by around 5:30 p.m., the snow was coming down so heavily that his vehicle became stuck. Joseph exerted himself heavily in his attempts to get his car moving again, yet after around a half hour of increasing frustration, he began to feel strange. He felt a shortness of breath, a tightness in his chest, along with an unusual tingling sensation up and down his left arm. To his horror, Joseph realized that he was experiencing the beginning stages of a heart attack. He climbed back into his car, started the engine to provide a little warmth, and then spent the next few hours praying that his symptoms would abate. Thankfully, Joseph survived the night, but suffering agonizing pain which kept him wide awake for the duration. He was too infirm to drive, so his only hope was to ride out the symptoms, then drive himself to a hospital once he was able. However, around midnight, he suddenly spotted the headlights of a vehicle creeping up the track behind him. The vehicle's headlights continued to illuminate the surrounding woods as a small group of people got out of the car, and according to Joseph, they were carrying flashlights, and one of them appeared to be a woman holding a baby. Joseph scrambled to roll down one of his car's rear windows, then called out to the group for help. But instead of running to his aid, the group switched off their flashlights and doused their headlights. Confused and dismayed, Joseph watched as the mysterious group climbed back into their car and continued down the track, past his cabin and deeper into the woods. Later that morning, once the worst of his pain had subsided, Joseph drove until he ran out of gas, then walked 8 miles down a deserted stretch of highway until he reached a skiing lodge that showed signs of life. After knocking on their door, the lodge's occupants rushed Joseph to a nearby hospital, and the route just so happened to pass the abandoned Mercury Montego. He later said that he was almost certain that the deserted car was the same one driven by the group that had chosen to ignore him, but Ted Wyer's mother said that didn't sound like her boy at all. Ted had always been partial to helping others, and she once recalled an incident where he rushed a friend to the hospital after they overdosed on Valium. But while this might constitute a glowing review for her son's character, it's also tantamount to a confession. It seems it wasn't just Gary Mathias with a connection to illicit drugs, and although there's no record of any of the others actually using drugs, their proximity to the trade of them might well explain their ultimate fate. The second significant sighting of the men was reported by the employee of a small-town grocery store in Brownsville. She claimed that 2 days after the men disappeared, they stopped by the store in a red pickup truck. The store's owner corroborated the story, claiming the men acted skittishly before departing as quickly as they arrived. The store's owner was also able to produce a detailed list of group's purchases, which included burritos, chocolate milk, and soft drinks. Ted Wyer's brother later confirmed that his brother had a habit of drinking too much chocolate milk, and that he'd been skeptical of the sighting until learning of that particular detail. In his mind, there was no doubt that at least one of the men in the red pickup truck had been his brother, but sadly, the trail ended there, and the next development in the case came with news that no one wants to hear. In early June, most of the high-elevation snows around Northern California had completely melted, and the search for the missing basketball team resumed in earnest. But ironically, it was a civilian that stumbled across the first set of human remains. On June 4th, a group of motorcyclists stopped by a trailer maintained by a campsite around 20 miles from where the Montego had been found. There, they found a trailer belonging to the U.S. Forest Service that appeared to have been broken into. The bikers approached the trailer and were immediately greeted by the stench of death. Some suspected a deer had somehow smashed its way through the glass before dying of its injuries on the inside. Yet when they located the source of the stench, they recoiled in horror. It wasn't the body of a deer. It was the body of Ted Wire. 11 miles away from where the first body was found, park rangers stumbled across the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling. Both corpses had been partially consumed by scavenging animals, with their bones having been scattered over a wide area. 2 days later, as he worked with a group of volunteer search and rescue personnel, Jack Hewitt's own father discovered part of his boy's skeleton under a manzanita bush around 2 miles northwest of where Ted Wire's body was found. The nearby discovery of Jack's shoes and jeans all but confirmed that the skeleton was his. The cause of death for all the men was thought to be hypothermia, yet despite the authorities expecting to uncover Gary Mathias's body in the days that followed, he was nowhere to be found. Instead, the cops found 3 Forest Service blankets and a rusted flashlight by the road, around a quarter-mile from Ted Wire's body. It suggested that Gary Mathias had survived the freezing night, but still wasn't clear why the men had abandoned their vehicle in the first place. Yet as more and more details of the investigation were made public, it became clear that there were much more sinister questions to be asked. As we've already covered, Ted Wire's autopsy stated hypothermia was to blame for his death, but bizarrely, the county coroner also suggested that starvation had contributed to his death. By the time his body was found, Ted had lost more than half his body weight, and his beard suggested he'd survived for a full 13 weeks before finally succumbing to hunger and cold. His feet were badly frostbitten, and there were early signs of gangrene around his toes and fingers. On a nearby table sat some of Ted's personal effects, including his wallet, an engraved ring, and a gold necklace. But there was also a gold watch that none of the men's families could recognize, and Ted's shoes appeared to have been taken from him, most likely before his death. Perhaps even more puzzling was the fact that Ted had never once attempted to start a fire, and this was in spite of the copious amounts of matches and kindling at his disposal. Heavy forestry clothing, which could have kept the men warm, also remained completely untouched, as did entire boxes of sea rations, which were later found in the trailer's storage compartment. It was enough food to keep all 5 of them alive for an entire year, yet, again, for some reason, it remained untouched. As such bizarre details are made public, Ted Weir's family made an attempt to explain them. They claimed Ted lacked, and I quote, the common sense to take care of himself. They went on to explain that he would sometimes ask why drivers had to come to a halt at stop signs, and once had to be dragged out of his burning bedroom because he was afraid he'd miss his alarm. While tragic, such a mental disability might well explain the nature of Ted's passing, but it soon became evident that he was not alone in the trailer, and that Mathias and possibly Hewitt had been with him. Mathias's tennis shoes were in the trailer, and there was evidence that Hewitt had been the one to cover Ted in a white sheet as a way of keeping him warm. While investigators had managed to piece together the circumstances of the men's deaths, it was still a total mystery how they'd come to be at the trailer in the first place. However, an area detective posited what he believed to be the most plausible theory. Since Gary Mathias has friends in a place called Forbestown, which just so happened to be on the route back home, the men might have become lost while trying to find it. Then, while driving down back roads they were unfamiliar with, their car became stuck and they set out on foot to search for help. The detective noted that the group continued along the road in the direction they were originally going and claimed that such purposeful motion like that is not consistent with the circular patterns traveled by those who genuinely believe themselves lost. In all likelihood, Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling succumbed to their hypothermia about halfway through the long walk to the trailer. Then, once the 3 survivors found it, they broke the trailer's window and attempted to survive there for as long as possible. Sadly, for 2 of the men, survival was a bridge too far, but the question remains, what happened to Gary Mathias and what caused the men to abandon their car in the first place? Some have suggested that the men's disabilities played a huge role in their poor decision-making, and that it was an unfortunate but inevitable tragedy brought on by a lack of proper supervision. But others have suggested that there's a very good reason the men were trusted to look after themselves, and that's because they'd proven capable of doing so time and time again. Some of the men might have been intellectually challenged, but Gary Mathias and Jack Madruga had only a history of mental health and drug abuse issues. They would have been more than capable of navigating between Chico and Yuba City, and what's more, their military training would have precluded them from suggesting they venture out into the cold, on foot, with little to no winter clothing. This leaves us with one perhaps irrefutable conclusion. Something scared the men so badly that they'd rather face death by hypothermia than whatever was potentially pursuing them. And not only that, but this mysterious threat kept them contained in the trailer for more than 3 whole months and potentially consumed their dead bodies following a failed escape attempt. Some kind of animal attack wouldn't be out of the question, but perhaps there's something else stalking the hills and forests of Northern California. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. I'd love to see you there. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, love that for you.